My name is Camilla Bowater and I am Whitney Straight's daughter. My father was a very adventurous person. Father always had to have excitement and challenge in his life. In World War II, he was an RAF ace, fighter pilot, and earned many medals for his courage. Later in life, my father was very successful in the business world. He became vice chairman of BOAC, as it was called in those days. He then went on to be vice chairman of Rolls-Royce. But in 1934, my father was a sensational racing driver.
40,000 people greet Whitney Straight, the United States speed ace, as he streaks round the last lap and past the finishing post to win South Africa's first Grand Prix motor race at East London. Straight's performance was magnificent. He tore through the field in his Maserati like a black bullet and covered the tortuous 91 miles Marine Drive course in 6 laps at the amazing average speed of 95.43 miles per hour.
In the early 1930s, Grand Prix racing was in its infancy. Now, famous names like Maserati, Alfa Romeo and Bugatti were transforming the sport with powerful, purpose-built race cars, which dominated the European and American racing championships, making their brave drivers household names. Rumor of these gladiators in their groundbreaking supercharged monster machines had quickly spread around the world, and on the other side of the planet in South Africa, a young motoring journalist hatched a seemingly impossible idea of inviting these daredevils and their magnificent machines to race on the southern tip of the African continent. It was an idea that would capture the South African public's imagination and come to define the country as a global motorsport destination.
So in 1934, the organizer, Brad Bishop, who was a British motoring journalist, who worked for the Daily Dispatch, a newspaper that still exists, sent a telegram to his friend Sammy Davis, who was a Bentley boy, famous Le Mans racing driver at the time, but also a motoring journalist, and told him about his plans to put on this race around what he thought would make an ideal racetrack, these roads that made the sort of 17-mile track. They were public roads. And Sammy Davis in the UK told some of his friends about this, including Whitney Straight, who was effectively making a business out of going racing. He was buying these racing cars and employing racing drivers, and they were paid to turn up at events all around the world.
And Whitney Straight looked at it and thought, you know, it was a financial business, so he wrote back and he said, well, you pay me £700, I'll bring my car, my brother will bring a car, and I'll get my friend Dick Seaman to bring a car as well. And we'll come down for £700 plus any prize money we get.
Without any formal backing at all, Brad Bishop said, we'll do that. We'll put up the money, having no idea where the money would come. And these 3 drivers turned up, and as a result of them racing in the 1934 Grand Prix, they effectively put South Africa on the map as a motorsport destination. And this was recognized by the South African public too. So in 1934, the population of East London was 30,000, and they had 40,000 people come for the first race. So they had more people at the race than the entire population of the East London city. And that just grew in popularity. In 1937, they had a crowd of about 70,000 people. Just incredible stuff.
Between 1934 and 1939, there were 5 South African Grand Prix held in the small town of East London on the wild coast of South Africa. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 brought the racing to an abrupt end, and international motorsport would not return to South Africa for another 20 years. By then, technology had moved on, and the heydays of those 1930 races were all but forgotten. But now, 80 years later, another man has a vision to bring Brad Bishop's idea back to life by revisiting those incredible 5 years of motor racing on the African continent.
South African Historic Grand Prix Festival is a unique event to South Africa where we will be bringing back some of the exact cars that raced in the 1930s to South Africa as a celebration of the people and of the cars that were the foundation of motorsport in South Africa, those first 5 races that took place in the 1930s.
This exact car behind me finished second in the 1937 Grand Prix and third in the 1938 Grand Prix. To take the car back to East London, to drive it around the original circuit.
We start off in East London at the East London Grand Prix circuit with a race, and that will be returning to the site of exactly where the 1930s Grand Prix took place. After the race in East London, we've got a 5-day tour going from East London through to Franschhoek, and we finish up at the Val de Vie estate just outside Franschhoek in the Franschhoek-Paarl Valley for what we're calling the Grand Prix Garden Party, which is really going to be something that no one will ever have seen, and a unique experience for the drivers.
So the opportunity to take our foray back to Southern Africa, to go and reenact, as it were, the South African Grand Prix of that period, would just be the best thing ever. I mean, it would be, for me, a full circle for the car. For people in Southern Africa, the opportunity to see the car, something that has huge history, along with the other cars that are going to go, just a wonderful thing to be able to do.
Well, I have quite a detailed and extensive history of what the car did whilst it was in South Africa. Very, very detailed indeed. So I'm hoping to meet maybe some of the people that will remember the car.
The city of East London, like its namesake, the Great British City of London, is a river port on the coast of South Africa. Established by the original English settlers in the 1820s, it achieved city status 100 years later in 1914. Since those early days, the city has grown in size and reputation, and today the striking metropolitan of Buffalo City is a hub of both tourism and industry. But its motoring legacy is not just in racing. It is also home to Mercedes-Benz in the region, where they build and export the world's right-hand drive C-Class models, amongst others. East London is also home to South Africa's first racetrack, and although today the 3-kilometre track is a shadow of the long 17-kilometre circuit of the 1930s, a section of what is in use today was part of that original circuit from the 1930 Grand Prix.
We are right here where history was made 80 years ago. So this really is history continued, because what happened was most of these cars were owned by teams or individuals who had professional racing careers. So they'd come here and race, and the cars would go back with them to Europe or to the UK, and they'd continue their racing lives there, and that's exactly what happened. Some of them have gone on to become some of the most famous racing cars in history. And they've come back here, some of the actual cars that raced in those races, not similar to the exact cars.
Mark was running this event, which is a very important event. It's a recreation to South Africans. This must be a tremendous thing to have these cars that ran in 34, what's that, 80-something years ago, and he managed to get them to reappear and come down here, and we felt, but I wanted to be part of it because it had been part of the original event, and it had won. Engine's the original engine, the steering wheel's the original steering, everything you see about the car is original. And this is the car that won that first Grand Prix in East London in 1934.
In 1934, the trip from England to South Africa would have taken several weeks by boat. But instead of accompanying his race cars by sea, Whitney Straight, his brother Michael, as well as friend Dick Seaman, flew themselves in a small private aircraft across the wild continent of Africa, arriving just a day before the event. And today, following in the footsteps of Whitney Straight is not only his original Maserati, but also his daughter, Camilla Bowater.
Well, I've always been very proud of my father's heritage and history, and when we heard that there was going to be another famous South African Grand Prix, we felt we had to come, because the last time he raced was for the Grand Prix in South Africa in 1934, and he won that race. And so it was the first Grand Prix that year, and it was his last race.
Both Whitney Straight's Maserati and Dick Seaman's MG K3, which came fifth in the first race, have returned to South Africa for this auspicious occasion. Accompanying them is a grid of almost 20 cars from overseas as well as South Africa, which raced during the 1930s Grand Prix, but have not rolled a wheel on the East London circuit for over 80 years.
Wonderful to be able to do it. Absolutely, what a privilege to be able to come back and experience the sort of things that they experience. Wonderful.
And the performance of them is just outstanding. You know, I'm doing maybe 70, 80 mile an hour down the track. They're doing 120 when they come past me.
When the tipper went past me, I was following and I thought, this is the best moment of my life. Very few people in the world can say that they've done that.
Although racing this generation of cars again at the East London circuit is a first ever experience for all the drivers, many in the field race their rare and expensive cars at well-known events around the world, such as Goodwood. But how hard do they race these machines that look like they should be handled with white gloves and kept in a museum?
We drive them at 100% and more. We're still breaking records with them, we're still going faster and faster each year. So firstly, if you put them in a museum, they deteriorate. So a car like this needs to run. You need to run it, you need to put fuel in it, you need to maintain it. Otherwise, all of the magnesium and other components just fade away, really. And so, but the beauty of driving them is they're actually really good fun to drive, which is kind of unusual and not what you would think from an old car.
Owner-driver Nick Topless is passionate about vintage and classic racing and has several cars in his collection. But one car in particular has a very special history with the South African Grand Prix.
So this is a 1935 ERA, English Racing Automobile. Was essentially the first professional race team in the UK. They were designed to compete in Europe or against the Europeans, so against Maseratis, against Alfa Romeos, against those sorts of cars, and they were phenomenally successful. The car came to South Africa in 1936 and 37, and it was lucky enough to win the 1937 Grand Prix. And so for me to come back and be able to, as it were, tread the same ground and do the same things was just wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And people talk about getting a tear in the eye. Well, of course you have a tear in the eye. You're concentrating, but you're still thinking, actually, this is really, really special.
When Nick's ERA, driven by Pat Fairfield, won the 1937 race, it was against a grid of formidable foes, including the world-famous German auto unions. To Today, people might wonder how a mighty mid-engine 6-litre V16 supercharged beast could be beaten by a 1.1-litre ERA. The answer is in the format. The race was run as a handicap race, meaning start times were staggered, allowing less powerful cars to compete with more powerful cars, and technically, the most consistent driver-car combination on the day should win. This format played into the hands of another smaller capacity 2-seater sports car, a 1.1-litre Riley Ulster Imp, which also scalped the German auto unions who'd been struggling with tyre trouble in the 1937 Grand Prix.
This exact car took part in the 1937 third South African Grand Prix. It was driven by a local garage owner from East London who was called Buller Meyer.
My name is Colin Meyer, and my granddad was Buller Meyer. And Buller Meyer owned this car in 1937, and he raced in the Grand Prix in 37 with it. He came second. My granddad, being a racing driver, was very much part of our family. You know, we always knew that he'd achieved a lot as a driver at his time, and so the memorabilia was always there, the photographs on the walls, the books, the articles, and the replica of the Barnes Trophy, because he went on in 1938 to actually win the SA Grand Prix.
The list of cars that took part in the races of the 1930s and again in 2018 reads like a who's who of manufacturers of the era. The famous Fords and Plymouths from the USA, the Germans with their Silver Arrows auto unions, the British with ERA, Austin, Riley, MG and Aston Martin, the French with the beautiful Bugattis, and of course the Italians with Maserati and Alfa Romeo. But none of the cars that raced in the South African Grand Prix has a history as checkered as the Alfa Romeo Tipo B.
I'm leaning against the 1934 Alfa Romeo Tipo B. Some people call it a P3, but technically it's a Tipo B. And it was the first single-seat Grand Prix car of any manufacturer. This was the dominant Grand Prix car of the sort of 1932 to 1935 era. Its South Africa history is unique because Richard Shuttleworth, who was a wealthy British gentleman, he won the Donington Grand Prix in Great Britain, which was a very grueling 300-mile race. And then he shipped the car here to South Africa, to East London, and raced it on the East London Grand Prix circuit. And unfortunately, had a very high-speed accident in the car and was in a coma for, I think, 4 to 5 days. And they finally were able to relieve the pressure on his brain, and he recovered, but he never raced again.
When the South African Grand Prix took place in the 1930s, it was clear that motor racing in South Africa had caught on. People flocked from all over the country, often driving for days on unpaved farm roads to get to East London. The 1937 Grand Prix drew a crowd of over 70,000. At the time, the largest live sporting event that had ever taken place in the Union of South Africa.
Quite how they accommodated 70,000 people on New Year's Day in 1937, I will never know. And you've got these fabulous stories of people coming down in their evening gowns from the night before, the New Year's Eve party the night before, coming down first thing in the morning to watch the Grand Prix the next day. And it just must have been the most fantastic, spectacular thing to come and do.
For eyewitnesses, seeing these cars racing in South Africa during the 30s would have been a spectacle of a lifetime. And seeing these rare machines racing in anger again in 2018 was seemingly just as special an experience. But But to have been at the 1934 Grand Prix, as well as witness the cars returning 80 years later, would be a true once-in-a-lifetime experience.
And you won't believe this. A lady came up to me and she said, I was at the first race and I spoke to Whitney Straight. Can you believe that? Yes, 94 she is.
that land with the first Grand Prix, 1934. I was here in the pits, so my dad brought me in here and I saw them. I spoke to a lot of people around. Whitney Strait, I met him. Well, I knew him because he's from East London. And I met the Germans, Cornelius and Montclair.
One of the things that has been really fantastic for me to see is the emotion and the reaction to people who've attended, both public and the participants. One of the drivers just said to me, we are reliving history here.
A news report of this very event at East London, and you can see Whitney Strait driving this car down that piece of road that we drove on at 150, 160 miles an hour. Unbelievable.
Well, I think we should all be honoured because, you know, the ERAs, the Maserati, the single-seaters and other sports cars haven't been here for a long, long time. South Africa is not endowed with a lot of pre-war racing cars. There were cars of this caliber here in the day. So to see them back again is absolutely fantastic for those of us that are particularly passionate about that period of motor racing.
We had no idea what sort of interest there would be here, but the people that we've met are real enthusiasts, and they absolutely love the fact that these original cars are back here and able to be seen again and run properly and all that sort of thing. It's a special moment for them as well as me.
I mean, I'm choked up about it, and because I think he'd rather thought that we were here and with him in mind, even if he's not with us here in body. So it's very special.
This has been very special to come back here and race on the site of where these cars raced 80 years ago. And it's just such a privilege to be back with all these cars and all these people and just, you know, soaking it all up.
80 years have passed since those first 5 South African Grand Prix of the 1930s. In that time, people have come and gone. Yet because of a few passionate enthusiasts, the cars have stood the test of time. And even though this generation of enthusiasts will have to pass on their passion, the hope is the memory of this incredible time of defining motorsport will always have custodians who safeguard the legacy of this bygone era.
People talk about being a custodian of cars, and we are. We don't actually own them, we just actually have them near us for a period of time and then they go to somebody else.